More than 2 years after the yellow vest protest erupted here in France over price hikes and the price of fuel, President Emmanuel Macron has called for a new referendum to change the constitution. His proposed plebiscite comes after the Citizens' Convention, in which 150 randomly selected members of the public were tasked with coming up with ways that France could meet its emissions target. Joining me in the studio now is our Environment Editor Mairead Dundas. Mairead, it's the first time the French people will be asked to vote on a referendum since 2005. What happens from here onwards?
Well, the referendum is still not a certainty. What the President has done is put forward a proposal to hold a referendum which would look at adding a clause to the first article of the Constitution. Specifically, the text would be added, "The Republic guarantees the preservation of biodiversity, the environment and the fight against climate change." But for it to go ahead, it needs to pass both the National Assembly and the Senate. Now, no hurdles expected in the lower house, given that Macron's party commands a majority there, but it could be delayed or even opposed in the Senate. As you mentioned, it's one of the measures put forward by this Citizens' Convention of the Climate. They put forward 149 measures. And this was a very important one, and the group really welcomed the President's decision last night. They met with him for 3 hours because it's seen as an indispensable measure. At the same time, it's largely symbolic. It will do very little to reduce emissions in the short term. Of the 148 other measures that they made, the government has confirmed that they'll only use around 40% of them in a future climate bill. Many people saying that only the weakest ones were included in that bill. So the group hasn't been entirely won over by the President's decision. Doesn't bode well for the government's efforts to really reduce emissions if only a handful of those 148 have really been taken on board. And one last thing, though, just this morning, Prime Minister Jean Castex has said that he hopes that this referendum can be held before the end of Macron's mandate in 2022, but that will all depend on the COVID crisis and the disruptions and delays that come with that.
Now, this comes as the High Council on Climate today issued a critical assessment of the government's COVID-19 recovery plan.
Well, this independent council, also set up by the President, has been somewhat critical, proving its independence. This report today out is no different. It's made up of scientists, engineers and economists, and what they say in this report is that the majority, 70% of the government's recovery plans, are not in line with carbon neutrality goal of 2050. Now, how did they make this claim? Well, what they did is they studied the government's €100 billion recovery plan announced in September, and they went through each measure, 97 of them, one by one, and rated them as either favourable, unfavourable, ambiguous, or business as usual. Now, business as usual leads to increased emissions. Of the 100 billion, only 28 billion were considered favourable, notably around things like transport and buildings. Agriculture, on the other hand, and forests were particularly lacking. France was, however, applauded for not investing directly in fossil fuels. This was a criticism that UN Chief Antonio Guterres made during the climate summit over the weekend. The G20 countries were still investing in fossil fuels. France excluded from this group, but still the report really highlighting that for COVID to be an opportunity for the environment, it needs to have an overwhelming majority and not just a handful of measures that are focused on a green transition.
Mairead Dundas, thank you so much for that.